Be seated. The intersection of two different landscapes hosts a wealth of activity and fecundity. Think of a field, walking through a field where that field meets a forest. The vegetation in that transition zone turns dense and biodiversity increases. In our watershed, that is a great place to go birding because they tend to congregate in those areas. Lots of cover, lots of food. Those transition places between one habitat and another, between one landscape and another, are called ecotones. And we experience these ecotones everywhere. We experience them on a large scale, like where a continent meets an ocean, or where the Great Plains meet the Rocky Mountains, or in the Chesapeake Bay and other estuaries where saltwater and freshwater come together, or where land masses give way to reed marshes. There are also numerous ecotones all around us. They're in our backyard. They're right outside of our building. The smaller you find the space, the ecotone, the more ubiquitous they become. These zones are places where two complex habitats meet and they host the creation of new life. Reproduction often increases in these areas. They're also one of the primary sites for evolution because it's in these ecotones that species encounter change. They encounter other life forms that they have to respond to and eventually adapt to. These kinds of meeting places happen in our lives as well. And we hear Matthew tell of such a place in the gospel reading that Haley read today, not the one that's in your bulletin, that's the wrong one. But the story about Joseph having this dream and Mary being with child. It's about this place, about this process. The mythic story from Matthew's gospel tells of a union between divinity and humanity that brings forth some kind of new life. When we try to control this story, we end up extinguishing the spiritual flame within it. People often tell me, they seem to relish in telling me, how they do not believe the virgin birth, as if it's a badge of their rational credentials. I don't believe that stuff. And then there are people on the other end of the spectrum who see this as a litmus test of orthodoxy. Both miss the point entirely, and they extinguish the spiritual flame that burns at the heart of this story. It is a myth that conveys a profound spiritual truth with which we must reckon. Whether or not it actually happened, that's not asking the most important question. The real question is, what does this mean for our lives? It's not a question of believe it, don't believe it. It's about whether we live it or don't live it. Many people see this meeting place of the divine and human not as an ecotone that gives life, but as a battle zone. Joseph is doing this in the story. He tries to control the life-giving power of this human encounter with God with his kind of rhetorically benevolent patriarchy. The text says, being a righteous man, he planned to dismiss her quietly. Sounds like a good guy for doing it quietly, right? But if you push it just a little bit, you realize it doesn't mention anything about the consequences of that kind of dismissal for Mary. Joseph experiences Mary's intimacy with God as a threat to his own masculinity. and he fails to see how this new life of which he is a part could set him free from that burden. Matthew, the storyteller, attempts to control this life-giving encounter by seizing control of Mary's sexuality. He labels her a virgin. Both her desire for God and her embodied spirituality make him very uncomfortable. You can hear him wrestling with how he tells this story. So he takes control of the way the story is told. Matthew's fear of Mary and of her body travels like a shockwave through history, marginalizing women's experience of God and their own bodies. At the heart of this story is an invitation to enter into this space, to this encounter between humanity and divinity. It's an incredibly unsettling place, yet it is filled with creativity. It's scary and it's fraught with peril, but it is also healing and full of promise. Many of us carry into this place wounds that other people have inflicted upon us. This place could be a healing balm, the beginning of some healing for those old wounds. Throughout history, men have controlled this place of divine and human encounter, saying who can enter and under what conditions. That male guardianship makes many of us hesitant to enter, myself included. I am so thankful that we have Mary at the center of this story, somehow holding at bay the patriarchy around her. So how do we get there? How do we live in this place, this ecotone of divine and human meeting? The ancient contemplatives, both women and men, have told us that we need to pay attention to our desire, our deep down desire as the pathway to a divine encounter. They called it eros, not agape, eros. One person describes eros as fundamentally the desire for relationship, the relationality that is in us and that is among all things. Eros is embodied existence. It is a mysterious and dynamic reality of desire. Our eros, our life energy, emanates from deep within us, and we feel it in our bodies. We feel it in that impulse toward creativity. We feel it in our fecundity. We feel it in our desire for relationship, for connection. How many of us here, how many of us long for that? For real, intimate connection with another person, with ourselves, with God, with the earth and all of the creatures in it. Yet there feels like a gap between us and it. Somehow there's a space there that we want to overcome and have intimate connection, intimate relationship. That desire to overcome that separation is eros. That is our desire. And that is the path to God. There will always be someone who tries to put labels on our deepest desires. Someone who will try to control it, someone who will try to water it down with rationalism and the yeah, buts. Some of those voices will be in our own heads, as we are always second-guessing ourselves, asking if this is just being self-indulgent, or am I really seeking honest, real, healthy, whole relationship? Sarah Coakley, the feminist theologian and Anglican priest, one who taught me how to think theologically, she encourages us to explore the meaning of our sexual desires within the context of Trinitarian prayer, even that part of our humanity, even that deep, visceral desire is to be welcomed into our spiritual lives, contrary to what we've been told, but to be welcomed into our lives as a pathway to the divine. True Christian spirituality and theology, she argues, turns Freud on his head. She writes, instead of thinking of God language as being really about sex, which is Freud's reductive ploy, we need to understand sex as really about God, about the deep desire that we feel for God, that precious clue that is woven into our existence about the final and ultimate union we seek. Our humanity is not obliterated when we encounter God. It is embraced.